The Unification Wars. The man who would later become known as the Emperor of Mankind first appears in imperial records as just one of the many warlords struggling for control of Terra during the later part of the Age of Strife in the early 29th millennium. Beginning at that time, and with the aid of his great friend and collaborator, Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor undertook a series of military campaigns against all the other techno-barbarian warlords on the planet that would later collectively become known as the Unification Wars. During these conflicts, the Emperor employed several military formations, such as the warriors of the unit design Geno-52, Kiliad, who would later go on to serve the Imperial Army that consisted of genetically enhanced warriors to maximize his tactical prowess. The most powerful of these troops were the Proto-Astartes, known as the Thunder Warriors. Though physically the most potent of his creations, more deadly in combat than even the later Space Marines, the Thunder Warriors were far from perfect. Having been created from adult troops who had undergone a rapid process of genetic, bionic, and chemical augmentation, many have difficulty coping with the psychological changes. Metabolic collapse leading to rapid death was not uncommon, and many Thunder Warriors were also prone to mental instability and even more psychosis as they aged. These warriors played a significant part in the Emperor's eventual victory over all the other warlords of Terra, and led him to believe that his future plans to reunite mankind across the galaxy would require the creation of an even more potent corps of genetically engineered military commanders and warriors. Following the Battle of Mount Ararat in the Kingdom of Uraktul, which was said in some sources to be the last battle of the Unification Wars, the unity of old Earth was at last achieved after standard centuries of blood, loss, and fire. With this victory, the planet and population of Terra were at last unified under the single rule of the Emperor. However, to make his dream of reuniting all of humanity within a single galaxy spanning empire possible, the Emperor knew that he would have to make some difficult, even immoral decisions. Their purpose having been achieved, the Emperor ordered all of the remaining Thunder Warriors to be liquidated. Their imperfections and propensity for mental decay rendered them a dangerous group of warriors to leave alive in a time of peace. They needed to be removed to make a way for their eventual successors, the Primarchs and the Space Marines. In truth, the Emperor was right to be worried about his creations. Another source claimed that even before the Unification Wars has ended, the Thunder Warriors at last realized that their creator had cursed them with short lifespans as a result of their imperfect genetic augmentations, and turned upon him for what they saw as his betrayal. It was a cadre of several hundred custodians, even then believed to have been commanded by the legendary Constantine Valdor, and accomplished by several thousand prototype Astartes of the First Legion of the newborn Space Marines that stood in the Emperor's defense, carrying out a merciless culling of the obsolete and rebellious Gene soldiers. Though some Thunder Warriors successfully escaped the cult, however, it happened. The vast majority of those who suffered the Unification Wars died at the hands of their own allies. Individually or in small groups, like the self-styled Dautar Thunder Warriors presented during the Cerebus insurrection of the early Great Crusades era, some Thunder Warriors would survive, living mostly anonymous and miserable lives amongst the population of Terra. all owners of the past forsaken, always fearful of being discovered. Fortunately for these survivors, the Imperium, believing them all dead, never truly sought to hunt them down, as all efforts were by now concentrated on the process of the Great Crusade. Officially, Imperial propaganda proclaimed that the Thunder Warriors had heroically died to the last man during the Battle of Mount Ararat, the greatest of their number, Aric Tyrannus, surviving just long enough to raise the Emperor's banner when victory and unity was achieved. But the Emperor could no longer wipe away the stain entirely, for the Thunder Warriors managed to escape what they called the culling, including Aric Tyrannus, who would yet have a role to play in the fate of the Imperious realm. With the unification of Terra achieved, the Emperor next set in his motion his plan to defend and better humanity across the galaxy by unifying those lost bastions of mankind scattered across the myriad stars under the aegis of the newborn Imperium. This extraordinary undertaking would become known as the Great Crusade. The Emperor prepared extensively for the Great Crusade and the years after unity was achieved on Terra. He created the special astropath corps to link his eventual interstellar dominion together through the use of telepathy, and engineered the creation of the Astromonarchy. This was a supremely powerful psychic navigational beacon powered by the Emperor's own will and psycho abilities that would allow simplified and safer interstellar travel through the warp across far greater distances than before. Chief among his designs, however, was the creation of the new legions of transhuman, genetically modified warriors, the logical extension of the gene troopers already under his command, though they would be far superior to the gene-enhanced troops of the Imperial Army he had used during the Unification Wars. The Emperor first undertook the Primarch Project, the creation of 20 superhuman infants, whose genomes had been designed using his own genetic code as the foundation, who were intended to mature into powerful generals and statesmen for his armies. The Primarchs would be the beings of such great mental and physiological superiority that nothing merely human could stand against them. To enhance the Primarchs beyond the capabilities that even the genetic engineering allowed, however, the Emperor also drew upon the powers of the warp he had learned at Molech to enhance his creations, imbuing them with nearly godlike levels of charisma and capability, but also unintentionally making them susceptible to corruption by the entities of the warp. However, this plan went awry with the intervention of the ruinous powers, who feared that the Emperor's designs to unite and improve humanity might succeed too well, vastly increasing the hold over order over the universe and diminishing their own strength. It is for this reason that all of demonkind refers to the Emperor as the anathema, the embodiment of the metaphysical opposition to chaos. While accounts vary as to what exactly happened, at the end of the tale is always the same. The Primarchs were cast into the warp and their gestation chambers from beneath the Himalaya mountains. In the Emperor's gene labs, despite the multiple physical wards the Emperor had laid down upon the laboratory and lost touch. In the aftermath of these events, the Emperor conceived a new plan using genetic samples that had been derived from the Primarchs' genomes. He created a caste of warriors who would possess some of the same superhuman qualities of the Primarchs and himself. These successors to the genetically enhanced human warriors of the Unification Wars era were the legions Astartes, the Space Marines, Legions of the first founding. After their creation, the Emperor led the 20 Space Marine Legions, all of their Astartes originally recruited from the Terra-born adolescent males, in their first missions to give the experience in war and diplomacy through the reconquest of the rest of the Sol system. The Space Marines drove alien slavers from the moons of Saturn and Jupiter, and most importantly, achieved peace and the eventual integration of Imperial Terra with the ruling of the Mechanic of Mars. This crucial military and political alliance formalized in 739 M30 with the signing of the Treaty of Mars, provided the Emperor with much of the technological means and material required to extend crusade into the sun. At the same time, the alliance formalized the creation of the Imperium of Man and established the imperial bureaucracy on Terra, integrating the mechanism as one of the myriad organizations that comprised the newborn Adeptus Terra, the massive government of the Imperium, the future priesthood of Earth. With the final abatement of the warp storms caused by the birth pangs of the chaos god Celeste, and ended by the fall of the Aldari, the Emperor finally began the Great Crusade in CA 798 M30 with the campaign remembered as the First Pacification of Luna. The Emperor's forces, concentrated amongst a rapid growing cadre of experimental fleets, rediscovered a long-lost human colony worlds, cast out alien oppressors, and claimed vast new territories for the newborn Imperium to exploit across the galaxy. Perhaps, most importantly, the Emperor, leading his crusade, rediscovered his lost sons, the Primarchs, as the expeditionary fleets pushed out deeper into the depths of unexplored space. Scattered across the galaxy, the Primarchs were found one by one over a period of many solar decades and reunited with their father and their own genetic sons in the Space Marine Legions. All were placed in command of the Astartes Legions, created from their respective gene seed, and played a major part in forging their father's Imperium. Together, they fought thousands of worlds into imperial compliance, establishing the rule of the Imperium over these worlds and indicating in them the values of the imperial truth: a materialist, atheist faith in reason, science and technological progress that rejected all vestige of human irrationality and superstition, including all forms of religions or faith. Only by promulgating the doctrines of the imperial truth did the Emperor believe he could begin to weaken the hold of the need for faith and the other irrational aspects of the human mind that birth and sustain the power of chaos and the warp. The Emperor himself declared that mankind would never be free to progress and advance to its destined position as the preeminent intelligent species in the Milky Way galaxy until the last stone from the last church was cast down onto the last priest. He had already purged ancient Terra of all of its ancient religions and superstitions, beliefs by the time of the Great Crusade began, even going so far to personally witness the destruction of the final church on Terra's ancient soil, after engaging its resident holy man, Uriah Olafir, in a battle of ideas, wit, and dogma. The imperial truth also held that humanity was the species which would rightfully rule the galaxy, since its physical form was both the most pure and all of the other intelligent alien races, such as the Aldari, had already tried and failed to maintain galaxy-spanning civilizations. Now, it was humanity's turn to find a place amongst the stars, as almost all intelligent alien species encountered by mankind had either proven to be irrevocably hostile to humanity or presented a future threat to human dominance and exploitation of the galaxy. Xenospecies were genetically to be exterminated outright if they presented the slightest threat or obstacle to the Imperium. The Emperor believed that the Imperial truth needed to be brought to all worlds of humanity, peacefully at first, but imposed by war if necessary. Because the Emperor believed that true unity was the only way for humanity to survive and prosper in the face of a very hostile universe. If this required the unfortunate use of force against those who refuse to understand this necessity, then so be it. Just as he had during the Unification Wars, the Emperor again lamented the loss of innocent lives and curtailing of individual freedoms that had the fleets of the Great Crusade sometimes trod upon. However, he could see no other way to safeguard humanity and weaken the endless corruptive power of the ruinous powers at the same time. While the imperial truth upheld the light reason and science, it did have one unbreakable prescription. Men must never develop machines capable of true thought. What scientists had once called artificial general intelligence, the Emperor remembered that it was the great war fought by humanity against thinking machines known as the Men of Iron that had helped destroy mankind's last united interstellar civilization at the end of the dark age of technology, and he had no desire to see the human race repeat its past mistakes. As such, when the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade encountered advanced human civilizations in the dark space that had developed artificial general intelligence, these worlds' populations were simply exterminated outright as potential dangers to the entire body of politic of the newborn Imperium. Additionally, there were an increasing concern as the Great Crusade progressed about the use of psychic sorcery by agents and warlords of the Imperium. The Emperor was the most powerful human psyker to have ever lived, but he was deeply ambivalent about the growing spread of mutant psyker genes through more and more of the human population. He rightfully believed that the most of mankind was not yet evolved enough, either psychically, physically, spiritually, truly to control the great power of the warp, or avoid the corruptions and temptations offered by its more malevolent denizens. More and more often during the progress of the imperial conquest of the galaxy, the Imperial Army and Space Marines would make plantfall, only to find that the populace were enthralled to mysterious powers and unnatural physics called sorcerers. These people were essentially members of chaos cults who would resist the forces of the Emperor with sorcerer's psychic powers granted to them by demon entities from the warp. These psychic powers were also very akin to those used by the Thousand Sons legions of Primarch Magnus the Red. The Thousand Sons had come under intense criticism for their use of sorcery by Primarch Mortarion of the Death Guard Legion, who knew by his own personal experience with sorcerers on his homeworld of Barbaros the dangers to be found in anything spawned from the warp, and Leman Russ of the Space Wolves Legion, for whom any battle fought through sight of halo, clever deceit, or by any trick other than straight physical combat was definition dishonorable. Russ found that the Thousand Sons' use of sorcery distasteful in the extreme. It was Russ who fought the hardest for the Imperium to ban the use of psychic powers after his own experience during several campaigns of the Great Crusade, where his Space Wolves had fought beside the Thousand Sons. The schism grew so great that it threatened the very stability of the fledgling imperium, and so the emperor himself called for an imperium conclave to resolve the issue once and for all. Both sides of the debate over the use of psychic abilities arrived at the world of Nicaea to determine the presence of their views, with the emperor as the arbiter, and throned above the dais in the ancient amphitheater that seated tens of thousands where the conclave was held. On the side of the question were the witch hunters like the Sisters of Silence, who presented their case by reciting a litany of human suffering incited by the emperor's own subjects, by sorcerers enslaved by what would eventually later be recognized during the Horus Heresy as chaos, of gibbering mutants who had lost their humanity, and cults of power, hungry men and women who turned their psychic gifts to dark purposes. All present were also aware of the terrible damage that had been done by the uncontrolled demon-possessed psychers during the early days of the Age of Strife. On the other side was a powerful advocate for the continued use of sorcery, the Primarch Magnus the Red. His very presence frightened many. However, he began to speak with the great charisma that only a Primarch could wield. His argument was that no knowledge was tainted in and of itself, and no pursuit of knowledge was ever wrong, so long as the seeker of that truth was the master of what he learned rather than his pawn. He spoke with finality that his 1,000 sons of Astartes had mastered the knowledge of sorcery, and that there was no knowledge too labyrinth for them to grasp, or what they could not master to serve humanity rather than enslaving it. Magnus called on the emperor not to ban the use of psychic abilities, but to contribute to further research into their usage, that they might be harnessed for more fully to benefit their humanity and the Imperium. Magnus had spoken passionately with great power, and the participants of the Council of Nicaea became even more divided. While they had strong arguments in their favor to justify their anti-psychic position, the witch hunters could not effectively match Magnus's persuasiveness. The tension could easily have been cut with a knife when a group of Space Marine librarians approached the dais. The Emperor acknowledged them with a nod, and all present fell silent. Among the group was some of the greatest librarians of the Space Marines legions. They formed a semicircle around the dais to indicate that they spoke as one voice, but it was a young librarian, Expositori, who spoke for the group. A psyker, he proposed, was like an athlete, a gifted individual whose latent talent must be carefully nurtured. Psychers were not initially evil in themselves, but like any tool, could be used for either good or evil purposes. Sorcery, however, was the knowledge of how to wield psychic powers that had to be sought for, even bargained for, with the foul entities of the warp. No one could be truly sure who or what had benefited in the deal. The librarians proposed that all psychers be strictly educated by the Imperium with the express purpose of using their abilities to serve mankind. This should become an immediate Imperial priority. The practice of sorcery would forever be outlawed as an unforgivable offense against humanity and the worst kind of heresy. The Council of Nicaea was also the trial of Magnus the Red, for he was accused of sorcery and of introducing sorcerous practice to the Space Marine legions through his lead role in the institution of the Corps of Librarians. As the evidence of Magnus' continued practice of sorcery become apparent, the emperor barely contained his wrath as he pronounced judgment of the Primarch of the Thousand Sons. The emperor had entrusted his son years before to obey his bidding and overseer and forswear the use of such occult practices because of its dangers inherent to the warp. He had entrusted only Magnus with the true secrets of the warp, to which only they remained privy. However, now it appeared that his son had disobeyed his edicts, and at the very least dabbled in the occult and the forbidden black arts of the sacred sorcery. The confrontation between father and son is recorded in the Grimoire Hereticus. The emperor's judgment at the Council of Nicaea proved severe, largely as a result of his anger at Magnus. The emperor rejected the librarians' proposed compromise outright, with the exceptions of navigators and astropaths who are properly trained, controlled, and sanctioned by the Imperium were necessary to its continued existence. The Space Marine legions were no longer to employ psychers within their ranks. He commanded that the Primarchs were to close their legions' librarianist departments forthwith and not to indulge the undoubted psychic talents of those Astartes who possessed the gift. All existing Space Marine librarians were likewise forbidden to make use of their abilities and were to return to duty as line warriors. The Council's ruling also created a new position amongst the Space Marine legions, the Space Marines chaplain to uphold the Imperial truth and help maintain the purity of the Astarte legions' dedication and fidelity to the Emperor's commands. The Emperor ordered Magnus once more to cease the practice of sorcery and incantation, and the pursuit of all knowledge related to magic. Magnus, of course, did not like the idea, and he remained bitterly opposing to the decision made at Nicaea. However, in the end, he bent his will to his father, the Emperor, and agreed to obey, though the mechanicness of the ruinous powers would ultimately lead to a far darker fate for Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons. The edicts of Nicaea stood largely untouched for the next 10,000 standard years as the primary imperial policy regarding human psychic mutation. Only the edict against the use of the librarians within the ranks of Space Marines and later the Astra Militarum would be revered as a result of the Horus heresy, as that terrible civil war made clear to the rulers of the Imperium after the conflict that Astartes and other sanctioned psychers were essential to combat the power of the forces of chaos. The Imperial Webway Project. Approximately 2 standard centuries into the Great Crusade, the Emperor decided to return to Terra to oversee a special project that he intended to cap his ambitions for humanity. This was the Great Secret Webway Project, in which the Emperor planned to employ the assistance of a special artifact from the Dark Age of technology, the Golden Throne, that had been discovered on Terra beneath a huge and inhospitable desert on the continent of Asia. The Emperor planned to use the Golden Throne to enter and reshape the labyrinth dimension of the Aldari Webway, to serve as a direct and instantaneous transport network between all the worlds of the Imperium. This human portion of the Webway would create the vast network of warp galaxies and gates that had once bound together the old ones and the Aldari's ancient interstellar empires, and would allow humanity to advance at a more rapid rate, scientifically and economically, than at any other time in its history. The Webway was a far more efficient means of travel, and most importantly, bypassed the depredations of chaos within the warp that represented a constant hazard of death of spiritual corruption to human faster than light space travel. The ultimate objective of the Webway project was for the Emperor to completely sever humanity from the need of the warp in its entirety. This would further deprive chaos of its power to corrupt and destroy and weaken the psychic immantations that powered and sustained the Chaos Guards through the protective psychic wards that shrouded every Webway corridor. All these benefits would come as the Emperors guided his species within the protective embrace of the Webway and its evolution to a fully psychic race. This would ensure its ascendancy on the galactic stage beyond what even the lost Aldari Empire had once managed to achieve and unleash a golden age of human civilizations unlike any known before. A human-dominated Webway would also truly unite the Imperium, preventing mankind from ever again being divided by the time and the great distance. But this process would require all of the Imperium's considerable attention, and had to be pursued in secret, lest the Aldari or other opponents of the project learn of it and seek to stop it before his efforts could come to fruition. The Golden Throne had been built during the dark age of technology to allow human access the Webway, and took the form of a heavily mechanized throne created from an unknown type of psychologically and physiologically reactive gold-competed alloy. It was suspended over a pair massive of doors comprised of the same golden alloy. These doors acted as the portal to the Webway and were supposedly large enough for a warbound class Scout Titan to walk through upright. The Golden Throne was originally located in the subterranean depths of the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor's gene laboratory complex had once stood. An era known as the Imperial Dungeon. Hundreds of red-robed mechanic tech priests and servitors toiled in the Imperium Dungeon. As the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne and used his immense psychic powers to hold the portal into the Webway open for his workers, who constructed a new sanction of the Labyrinth dimension intended to connect terror to the rest of the largely abandoned transdimensional transport network. Because the Webway had been constructed from a physically resistant material intended to protect it from the penetration of the entities of the warp, and humanity did not possess the technology required to replicate it, the Emperor had to personally shield the new human-built sanctions of the Webway from the warp incursions. This required him to remain on the Golden Throne continuously, and was the reason why he had been forced to leave the Great Crusade in the hands of his Primarchs and return to Terra to oversee the project personally. As such, following the extraordinary victory of the Imperial forces over the Great Orc War, encountered by the Imperium to that time during the All-in-All Crusade, the Emperor decided that he was no longer directly needed to command the efforts of the Great Crusade. To this end, the Emperor placed Horus, his favorite and most talented son, in charge of the military advancement of the Great Crusade in his stead. Horus, the foremost amongst the Primarchs, and was the first rediscovered by the Emperor on the dying world of Synthonia that lay so close to Terra that warp drive was not needed to reach the planet. Horus was only the Primarch to serve in the Great Crusade alongside his father for many solar decades, and was the most highly honored of the Emperor's sons, the Primarch he most trusted and most loved. The two had fought together at the forefront of the early Great Crusade. The Emperor had protected Horus during the siege of Relis, while Horus repaid the favor during the Battle of Goro. During the Battle of Geos Thravian, the Emperor slew the mighty orc war boss, Garkul Black Fang, after he had held off the three of his Primarchs. With such a history between them, the Emperor felt that Horus was the man to lead the Great Crusade in his absence, granting Horus the unique title and rank of War Master. The emperor declared that the time had come for his sons to show him what great leaders they were. Turning his back on direct military matters, the emperor created the Council of Terror, the persecutor Centaurium Imperialis. The emperor tithed and expanded the civil governing and bureaucratic bodies of the Imperium, like the Adeptus Administration. Before retiring in seclusion beneath the imperial palace to begin his work upon the Golden Throne and the Webway project. But the emperor's decision to not tell his sons why he had retired to Terra, as well as his decision, began shifting the Imperium's government out of the direct control of the Primarchs of the War Council and to Terran nobility and bureaucrats from whom they devastated, sowed the seeds of discord among the Primarchs. So, too, the disquiet over the Emperor's decision to raise Horus above his brothers by naming him the War Master and thus their commanding officer. From these seeds of ambition, pride, and jealousy, the Chaos Gods will find fertile ground to corrupt many of the Primarchs and bring on the horrors of the Horus heresy.